We were gathered in the cockpit looking over the survey data from the system. We knew what was here. We just wanted to confirm. 8 planets, 5 dwarf planets, dozens of moons. Good system to grow out of, lot of resources and space, but it was the 3rd planet that held our interest, as it was clearly populated. Satellites and low-orbit shuttles buzzed around it, and we could see a few small orbital stations that had been built. They were more advanced than the data we had acquired from that sketchy Ikori had said they'd be, and it caused a stir among our crew. If they had strong enough radar technology, they would see our approach, and that could go badly indeed. Pre-contact species were often aggressive and didn't take kindly to intruders, so they'd have to be careful. Our ship was a medium-sized vessel, but had no weapons. The power draw of the cloak was too great. If we got spotted, it'd be the end for us, and the crew was arguing about just running to Cheplo 3 and hiding out until the Ikori forgot about us. This was a risk for us, as if the humans detected our FTL drive spooling, or just had the ability to see through our cloaking tech. We'd be dead before we could leave the system. But that Ikori wanted a human and a human he'd get, and with the amount he was paying, we felt we could be a bit bold. I did as well. The payment was ludicrous for what seemed like an easy run. The Ikori had gotten wind that humans might make good slaves and hired us to get one. We weren't kidnappers, just smugglers, but we had debts from the last job and the payment was too good. We had to take it. If I had known what that human would cost us, I'd have sided with the ones who wanted to flee. We came in low, closing in on the dark side of the planet. Most of the shuttle traffic was around the upper section, so we aimed towards one of the lower continent's eastern edges. Half their coastline was lit up like an Lender 9 nightclub, so we figured it was a good bet. As we got closer, we realized why. Most of the inner region was a massive desert, but there was extensive rivers and forests towards the coastline. The city we found was too densely populated for us to really grab anyone safely, so we flew south towards a smaller one we'd seen. It was too densely populated as well, but on the horizon were darkened mountains. We flew to them as fast as we could, paranoid we'd been spotted, but if the humans had spotted us, they didn't show it. The mountains were mostly dark. Few pockets of people here and there, and farmland dominated our view. Perfect, we thought, easy pickings. We found one house that was out of the way and surrounded by trees. Rolling green hills covered the landscape, and we had to land far closer to the house than we really wanted to, but we were emboldened by so few people being around. We thought a simple snatch and run would be the easiest, and as I led the small away team out of the ship and towards the house, it was like the stars aligned. A human female had come out of the brightly lit house holding some kind of primitive telescopic device on a tripod. She was about our height, maybe a smidge shorter, and didn't look overly strong. We had no real idea as to her capabilities, though, so we opted for a stealth approach. We watched as she set up the tripod, then walked back inside to turn off the light, calling out to someone else in the house. My second in command snapped his tranquilizer rifle up and tracked the human through the sights as the rest of us got into position. The moment the dart hit her shoulder and flooded her bloodstream with sedative, we pounced, scooping her up and bolting back to the ship as fast as we could go. The takeoff was a bit noisier than we had wanted, but when no one pursued us, we thought we were in the clear. We left Atmos slowly, trying our best to not create any unneeded sonic booms. Shoving the unconscious female in the small cage we had bought as our pilot got us out of there. As the pilot proceeded to spool up the FTL drive, there was a crack from the rear of the ship, and the entire thing was shunted to the side, causing all of us to be sent sprawling onto the floor. The repairs that we had gotten at that last station hadn't held together well, and had finally burst with the stress of the FTL activation. Whatever fates were watching over this human, they were angry we had taken her. The fix would take a couple of hours, and while we had the parts and our engineer had the expertise, we were uneasy. The timing seemed too coincidental, and a couple of the crewmates argued we should just space the cargo and run, that this was a sign we shouldn't be doing this. I overruled them. It was just a coincidence, just a cruel twist of the universe. They settled down when I reminded them of the payday we were about to get. that the hard part was done and all we had to do now was wait and deliver her to the Ikori once we'd jumped. The first hour passed, and we saw very little but a decrease in orbital traffic. Nothing to be alarmed about, after all. It was night on our side of the planet, probably fewer passengers. What was alarming was the effect that Tranquilizer had on our cargo. She had been knocked out for almost 4 times the amount of time she should have been, and I sent one of the boys to go check it out. Sitting in the cockpit, I watched through the cameras as he approached her unconscious form. He was scared, and rightfully so. You never knew what a new species was capable of, and he edged closer to her cage. She just lay there, and he opened her cage door to prod her with the long pipe he was clinging onto like a mother's skirt. I cursed the fates he did that, because that human snapped up with incalculable speed, grabbed the pipe and lunged at him. I didn't know if he was dead or just unconscious, but it didn't matter when that human ran out the door and into the ship proper. I sounded the general alert, but already I was seeing the human rampage through the mess hall where most of the crew were lounging. They stood no chance, as her strength and speed gave her such an edge over us that even those who were armed didn't manage to get a shot off. I scrambled to the front of the cockpit and bellowed orders over the microphone, flooding the ship with my panicked voice. I saw the human running through corridor after corridor while the few remaining crew members grabbed kinetic rifles and ran to find her. The first one to find her was my second in command, and I watched as she pounced on him as he fired wildly. The pipe came down and sank into his skull with sickening speed, the human racing off almost as soon as she had arrived. By now her clothes were stained with our blue blood, but I also saw red streaks along the corridors. She had been wounded. That thought was the last that entered my mind as I saw with horror which corridor she was in, grabbing my gun and pointing it towards the aft door, closing it as the human got closer and closer. It shut just in time, and I heard her throw her body against the structure. It buckled horrifically under her weight, and the mounting strained to contain it. In panic, I fired a shot through the door, and I heard a scream as it connected, but that only made her angrier. 2 more slams and the door came off its mounting entirely, slamming into the consoles in front of it as the frenzied human stepped inside to find where the shot came from. She was halfway across the room to me when she noticed the gun and stopped dead in her tracks, eyeing it warily. Evidently, whatever panic and rage had kept her going recognized what I was holding, and her eyes slowly grew wide as fear overcame the panic. Before either of us could do anything, a bright light slammed through the cockpit, and both of us snapped our heads to look out the large front window. There was a ship out there, small and seemingly armed, and it wasn't alone. 2 others came up to flank it, and the radar screeched as its newly damaged circuits worked out we were surrounded. A burst of garbled static came over the intercom before a voice came through clear as crystal. UNOP. Unidentified craft, give us your name and... Hey, wait a minute, you're not a human! I saw the pilots of the ships outside raise out of their seats slightly as they stared at the scene in front of them, each of them coming to their own conclusions about what was going on. By the looks on their faces, it wasn't good. Over the garbled sounds of whoever was speaking, probably contacting their home base, I heard the human female call out. She ran towards me, staring outside and waving her arms, and as she did so, my blood ran cold. 3 of my crew members came running out of the port door, rifles raised to defend their captain. I snapped my head to look at the ships and threw my arms up, calling for them to stop, but their triggers were already pulled down. The crew of those ships watched, unable to do anything, as almost 24 kinetic rounds ripped through that human's body, causing it to snap this way and that in a macabre dance from the force of the rounds. She slumped forward over the center console, bright red blood covering everything. The cries of panic and alarm from the human over the comms needed no translation or interpreter. 2 years had passed since that horrific day. Every ambassador of the Galactic Federation had viewed the footage from that ship almost a dozen times. Some could stomach it, pale though they often got, but I always looked away in the final moments, sickened by the human's fate. The fact that the kidnappers were my own species stung far more than it should. I had been raised to believe all Telvar were noble and dedicated to peace, and this was a slap across the face to my most closely held beliefs. We weren't fighters or criminals. We were diplomats, peacemakers, ambassadors. But the humans had stripped that ship, reverse-engineered its comms, and blasted every frequency they could with the atrocities that were committed. They demanded answers, demanded any reason that they could tell both the family and their species as a whole, and the Federation had responded quickly to try and soothe the issue. But as more people learned what happened, it just got worse. The Telvar were demonized across the galaxy for the actions of that crew, and as more information came out about the events surrounding the kidnapping and the humans came to the Galactic Council itself to demand something be done, it was clear our species would never recover. Trade agreements that had lasted centuries were shattered as the outrage from humanity spilled out into the wider galaxy, and we now risked expulsion from the Federation for the actions of just a few. Even the outrage that the humans had put the kidnappers to death did nothing to stem the tide of hatred towards my people. I mused on all this as I sat among representatives from a dozen other species on a shuttle that slowly descended into the humans' home world. I caught herself looking out the window next to me, not listening to the human guide as he spoke welcomes and well wishes, and forced myself to focus on his words, but I just couldn't shake the image of that girl being shot from my mind. Was this the country that captured human was taken from? Did she see it again through that window before she was killed? As we landed and stepped out of the shuttle, a large group of humans met us. There was the usual group of reporters and media, but a large number of escorts and public. Many of them had signs plastered with depictions of a Telvar, and as my smart contacts translated the text, I felt ashamed. Murders, killers, kidnappers, criminals. The outpouring of hatred towards my people was immense. The fact they showed up to this landing, ostensibly a peaceful outreach to try and mend the wounds that were caused, and showed up prepared and filled with hate, spoke much to the pain those kidnappers caused. I stepped out with the group and followed along as we were ushered through the carefully parted crowds to the awaiting vehicles, so we could be taken to the embassy that was established a few months prior. But as I stepped towards the vehicles, one of the humans stood in front of me, speaking a low apology and gesturing to a different vehicle a short distance away. It was smaller than the others, made for just a few people, not a party. I hesitated for a moment, but another human came up to me. He was dressed in the same suit the ambassadors I had met previously had been in, but his voice was far harder than theirs. "Ambassador Gudrun, someone wanted a private word with you before the meeting. It's been cleared through channels, if you will follow me, please." I murmured my assent and walked to the vehicle with him. He waited for me to climb inside and closed the door behind me, almost slamming it. I sat back in the seat and saw two humans seated opposite me. One was clearly older, his short cropped gray hair marking him as current or former military, and clearly past fighting age, while the other was younger, maybe mid-30s, with long brown hair that framed his face. The gray-haired man rapped his knuckles on the window to the driver's compartment behind him, and the anti-grav drive hummed as it spun up, lifting slowly off the ground. "Ambassador Gudrun, I am Brigadier General Martin Ashcroft. This is my son James Ashcroft. We just wanted a word with you before the meeting took place. Don't worry, you'll be perfectly safe. We're not kidnapping you." He gave a half-hearted, though sincere-looking grin, but the man next to him flinched at the remark. He was right, though. I had been worried. "Am I in some kind of trouble?" "Not at all, ma'am. We just wanted to show you something before we engaged in formal dialogue with you. It will only take us a few minutes to arrive there. We planned your landing to be nearby." Both men fell silent, watching the landscape fly by outside the tinted windows. I watched them curiously, and the brown-haired man occasionally glanced my way before looking down. It indeed only took a few minutes to arrive there, but I knew not where there was. The general opened the door and got out, offering me his hand in assistance. I took it gladly, getting out and looking down at our surroundings. We were at a park in a small town of some kind. There were buildings surrounding it, but nothing more than a single story. The park was filled with flowers of all kinds, and the air was heady with the scent of spring, but it was the statue in the center that dominated my mind. The moment I saw it, lit up and made of pure gold, I knew exactly who it was. A depiction of the captured human sat on a pedestal in the center of a field of flowers, and as I approached it, I realized it was a perfect depiction. The artist has clearly spent a very long time getting every detail perfect, from the ruffles in her pajamas to the look of wonder on her face as she looked up at the night sky above them. Sitting next to her, almost double the height of her cross-legged form, was a telescope, the same one the cameras on the crew had shown her using that night. "She was my daughter," a soft voice said next me, and I turned to see James Ashcroft had walked with me to the statue. I had been so distracted I hadn't noticed him. "She loved the stars, loved space. She dreamed of going to Mars once the colony got up and running." He fell silent again, staring at the golden depiction of his daughter, his face the picture of remorse, then horror, hatred, anger, and finally pure, unfiltered loss. "I was meant to be with her that night. We were going to look at a comet together, but my job wanted me to fill out a ton of paperwork at the last minute." I hesitated before replying. "Words cannot express my sorrow, Mr. Ashcroft. I don't know what I would do had one of my children been torn from me in that way." He was silent for a long time, and I almost thought he didn't hear me until he spoke. "I know all Telvar aren't like them. I have to believe that. You're like us, some good folk, some bad folk. You have children, so you know how I feel, how I felt. I wanted you to come here, to see this, to understand it." I watched the man stare longingly at his daughter's unmoving face before he turned. "No matter what happens between our people, promise me another family won't suffer as I've done. I don't care what you have to do to. Just keep that promise." I swallowed before speaking, my voice hoarse as I took in his words. "I swear it upon my own children. No one will suffer like you have." He didn't respond, just stared into the void for the longest time before walking back to the vehicle. I watched him leave and began to move back myself, but something stopped me. I found myself looking back at the statue and the flowers surrounding it. As my eyes roamed over the scene, taking it all in and memorizing every detail, I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier, a plaque cast in some kind of metal alloy. I stepped closer, about to let my contacts translate, but found it wasn't needed. On the plaque was written something in both humanity's common tongue and Telvan. I read it through, and as I did so, the words crashed into me like a tsunami. I felt all sensation leave my body as emotion after emotion slammed through my mind. Grief, anger, hate, sorrow, remorse, and then finally my brain cut off the trauma by just forcing me to become numb. I stared at the words, reading them over and over again, burning them into my memory. I swore to herself that I would do anything I needed to do to fulfill the promise I made to James. No matter what was asked of me, what was demanded of me, I would devote my entire life to this one singular cause. I felt myself collapse to the ground, my legs slamming into the paved stones circling the statue. I didn't even register the pain it caused. My body was completely dead to sensation as I stared at those words. Catherine, Kitty, Ashcroft, cruelly torn from her home as she stared at the stars. It's humanity's hope that she's among them now. The 24th of March, 2087 to the 25th of February, 2099.